My name is KDC. I work with Mid-Atlantic TAB, and that is Technical Assistance to Brownfields program. And our particular office is based here in Morgantown at West Virginia University. But we provide free technical assistance throughout EPA Region 3, and that includes Delaware, Maryland, Pennsylvania, Virginia, West Virginia, and Washington, D.C. And we do this in partnership with Marshall University, the University of Delaware, as well as the Virginia Tech Community Design Assistance Center. So together we are able to reach out throughout the region and be able to provide assistance in many different ways. Next slide, please. So again, the TAB program is available and funded through the EPA. So there is no cost for the assistance that we provide. Some of the ways that we can provide assistance and resources includes any help you may need when it comes to acquiring, assessing, and cleaning up brownfield properties for redevelopment, helping you understand and navigate the health impacts of brownfield sites, understanding how science and technology are used for this site assessment, remediation, and redevelopment in order to reuse the site, and then how to comply with voluntary cleanup. So those are just some examples. We always say that we welcome any questions that anyone has. If we don't happen to know it right away, we have a lot of folks in our network that we can reach out to. And that includes the great folks that we have joining us here today. Next slide, please. So some of the services we provide includes education and outreach. That can be in person or a webinar, such as today's. EPA grantee support, EPA application support for those who are looking to apply for an EPA Brownfield grant, as well as technical assistance, whether that is site-specific or area-wide. And we welcome you again for joining us today. We're going to touch on some of the information that will be covered in your agenda. Next slide. So Mike and Meredith are going to be touching on due diligence and historic preservation, tools and resources, and then finally we will conclude with some resources and information. Next slide, please. So Mike is going to kick off this information with letting you know what you need to look for when it comes to due diligence. But we found it necessary to explain to you that there is the historic site due diligence and there is the brownfield site due diligence. So I will just hit the highlights here. When it comes to brownfield sites, it is important to do your due diligence before taking ownership of a property because when it comes to brownfield sites, you're looking for liability protection. So if you do not conduct what's called a phase 1 environmental site assessment or all appropriate inquiry, it could deem you a potentially responsible party for contamination that happened on the site. So by conducting that phase 1, it kind of draws a line in the sand that says, I understand what is here. I'm taking ownership after the fact. I am not responsible for the contamination. It also makes you eligible for funding if you if you have that phase 1 environmental site assessment done before you take ownership. And when I say you conduct it, I actually mean a qualified environmental professional. And then certainly it makes you aware of potential contaminants on the property so that you know what you are getting yourselves into. When it comes to historic sites, as you're going to learn more about that information, when you're looking at your due diligence, that means the information and steps you should take in order to make an informed decision. And also this pertains to the actual building and regulatory issues. So again, thank you so much for joining us today. So much of our work overlaps with historic buildings and historic sites because they are older. They are considered both brownfields, and some are either historic buildings themselves or they are considered contributing to a historic district. So hope you find this information interesting and helpful to learn how you can start to stack some of this information and the resources available. So, all right, I think we have one more slide. I'm sorry, I do. Just want to be a little bit cheeky with you and tell you how important it is to get your phase 1 environmental site assessment done. When it comes to a brownfield site, we are so serious about it that we have t-shirts. All right, thanks. Good luck, Mike.
All right, thank you, Katie. All right, I just wanted to go through, I'll go through quickly some due diligence listing. It's similar to brownfield due diligence. You may have some liability issues if you don't complete all of your due diligence before you buy a building or start a project or start something. So I just wanted to go through a few. If I go really quickly through some things, there's a link in the presentation here for where I got some of the information from. Next. One of the most important aspects of due diligence when you're considering purchasing or starting a project is to get a survey of the property. I've been involved in some projects, including one right now, where the building doesn't actually sit on the property. It's on somebody else's property, or a portion of it is on somebody else's property. The opposite is true in one of my projects right now, where we have a little more property than we thought we had, so we can do some activities that we hadn't anticipated. You want to know where your utilities are, what kind of utilities there are. Is there municipal water or not municipal water? Is there a sewer system, utilities, and things like that? That'll impact the cost and your future activities. The next important one, I'm going to skip around here some. Inspect the property just as you do a phase one to identify potential environmental issues. You want to do an inspection of the property to identify other issues such as structural integrity of the building. Is it large enough to do what you want in it, or is it strong enough to do what you want? Is there a heating and ventilation and air conditioning system in the building? Are there other systems in the building that you need to take into account when you're doing your project? The next significant one is environmental, but Katie mentioned that. And then zoning permits and approvals. You need to know which jurisdiction you're in, whether you're within a city or not, whether that city has a zoning or a building code official, and how you get your permits and approvals done. There may be special regulations or provisions such as a tax increment financing district or a business improvement district. And then you want to know what possibility for architectural, there may be a possibility for historic district review, and I'll go through that in a second. And there also may be a possibility of architectural review, not historic. The West Virginia legislation does provide for architectural design review in the zoning ordinance legislation. So it's separate and independent of historic review. Next. Next. Oh, thanks. Stay there. All right. One of the first things you'll do, and Meredith is going to go into it in more detail than I am right now, is that there may be a regulatory review on your property. If you're using federal funds or state licenses or federal licenses, you'll have to go through what's called the 106 review. So you need to determine that if one's been done or if you need to do a new one. There may be design review you'll need to go through, and that's through a historic landmark commission, which is generally a city or a county agency. There are historic district commissions, and then there are design review ordinances. There may be an interesting aspect that we don't often recognize. There may be a covenant or a lien against the property. And I'm not talking about financial information right now, but I'm just talking about other type of liens. For example, if you had received a historic preservation grant or some other kind of grant, such as a facade grant from a municipality, there may be a provision in that grant that you can't change it without review for the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. So you need to know if there's any liens on your property. You need to know if there's a historic tax credit recapture period, which is generally 5 years after the owner has done a tax credit project, or a new market recapture period, which is generally 7 years. And there might be a low-income housing tax credit holding period on the property. Meredith is going to go through the design standards, but most of the standards that are in use by any design review commission start out with the National Park Service's Secretary of the Interior standards. Other historic preservation tools that may be available because you are within a historic district or because the property is historic include grants, historic tax credit, and planning assistance. And again, Meredith will go into more detail on that. And then on the building itself, if you're dealing with a building or a site, there may be some information available. There may have been a historic structure report done on the building that was funded by the State Historic Preservation Office or somebody else. There may be a feasibility study or a facility study, such as something funded by the Opportunity Appalachia program. And through those studies, there may even be existing rehabilitation plans or schematic plans that'll get you started on your rehab. Next. So the benefits, why do we consider historic preservation significant? And it is to save and preserve our history and the historic buildings in our communities, but it's not only because of that. There are financial incentives. It increases the public awareness of the value of historic architecture and the importance of design. It helps property owners and contractors and architects in making good design decisions. For example, there are treatments you can do to a building, a historic building, that would actually damage it or cause it to deteriorate rapidly, such as the wrong type of mortar when you're doing a repointing or a masonry repair project. So you want to be able to provide assistance to the property owners. We're not only the design police, we're really here to help people. You want to improve the quality of development, and you want to help when there's a government agency or regulatory agency involved. The three red highlighted topics includes those that relate to the overall character of the historic district. You want to preserve the integrity of the district, and you want to protect the value of your and public investment. And that's not, again, that's not just a aesthetic decision. For example, you don't want to spend $2 million on the rehabilitation of your building when next door the property owner has spent $100,000 and done it all wrong and decreased the value of the neighborhood. Next. So a recent study, well, not quite recent, but a study in the city of Raleigh by the Place Economics Group found that in designated historic districts that have design review, the value of property changed greater than the value of property in National Register historic districts that didn't have design review, and much greater than the similar neighborhoods in the city of Raleigh. So that's one, your property values were increased. Next. Again, a study by Place Economics showed that in Savannah, showed that historic districts see lower foreclosure rates than other neighborhoods in the city. The property values in historic districts generally stay protected or increase, and that the sale of buildings in historic districts outperform the sale of buildings in similar neighborhoods in the city as a whole. Other benefits include you reduce the landfill materials if you're rehabbing a building versus building new and demolishing a building and putting it all in the landfill, and you reduce the infrastructure requirements. That's one of my big bugaboos. I hate to see a new development on the outskirts of town that's going to require new roads, new sewer, new water, new utilities, when we have all of that in our downtowns already. And so we should take advantage of what we have existing. A Wisconsin Main Street study found that retail sales and storefronts that were rehabilitated increased retail sales. They generally drew in new customers who were curious about the change. and they brought increased rental income for the property owners. Next. We're currently going through a potential change to the tax credit regulations on the federal side. And so the Historic Tax Credit Coalition has put together a fact sheet that describes what has happened as a result of the historic tax credit from 1977 to 2023. And I'll just hit three of the highlights. One is that there were 49,000 historic buildings that were rehabilitated and therefore saved. There was $235 billion of investment in historic buildings and historic districts. And there were more than 665,000 housing units that were created or rehabilitated. And in a time when we're talking about the shortage of housing and the critical need for housing, that's really significant. Next. Right, so I want to go through a few examples of projects in historic downtowns or on historic buildings that we have been involved with. And I will note, if I don't say it during a discussion on a particular project, all of the projects took advantage of brownfield programs, either assessment programs, phase 1 projects or phase 2 projects, or remediation projects, or planning. So if I don't say it, just note that everything I'm talking about was a combination of historic preservation and brownfields. Next. The first one is a small historic district in the center of West Virginia. I keep forgetting that I may be talking to a broader area than West Virginia. So Sutton is in the middle of the state. It's got a small downtown historic district, and the buildings we're talking about are the red brick in the middle of the photograph and the stone building to the right of it. They were contributing buildings in the historic district. Next. And in 2005, I thought it was 2015, but when I looked at my records, it was 2005. There was a devastating fire in both of those buildings. The fire started in the left building and went unnoticed because it spread through the rear of the building. There's a space between the building and the hillside behind it, spread to the adjoining building through the back, and then finally just took over the entire building. And you could see what was left after the fire. Next. The owner decided to donate the building on the left to the city. And the city, through its Community Development Corporation, which is also an on-track, which is a subset of Main Street program in West Virginia, decided that they wanted to retain the face of the building in order to keep the integrity of the overall district, but build a park behind it. And so Main Street provided some design assistance to that effect. And we had a pretty good design, if I may say so myself, and some good ideas. Next. Additional funds were used to prepare a fundraising plan and to study the efficiency or the validity of doing this project, and then also to do engineering studies and plans to stabilize and protect the wall so that it wouldn't fall down even though there was nothing behind it. Next. The other building involved in the conflagration, I think that's the right word, was the stone building on the right side. That building was purchased by a local artist from the property owner after the fire, and he used it. He and his wife had a sculpture studio, and they used it for their large-scale sculptures. They were getting into large-scale environmental sculptures in community parks and things. And so when it didn't fit in his normal sculpture studio, they built it here or put it together here and then shipped it out. Next. And so the future now holds that the city decided they didn't want to proceed with their project. They gave the building back to the property owner. The property owner gave it to the artist, and the artist is going to be constructing a sculpture park behind the facade of the original building. He works pretty slow, so I'm not sure when we'll see it completed, but something's on the way finally. Next. The next example is the 1400 block of Market Street in Wheeling. This block is very historic, middle 19th century to late 19th century buildings in a significant portion of town. They'd been vacant and abandoned, and the city currently owns them and solicited proposals from developers to do something with the buildings. They went through a couple of developers and then finally did settle on a development team that they're working with. Next. The buildings were significant in the history of downtown Wheeling. One of the buildings had a nightclub in the first floor. Another building had a restaurant that was well known in the first floor. And then on the upper levels, there were gambling parlors. Whether they were legal or not is probably not in question, actually. But the buildings were owned by a significant underground person in Wheeling. Next. So it was important to preserve. Both Wheeling and the Wheeling Heritage Area were significant in its preservation. And if this video should show who's involved and what the future of the site is. Can you play the video? Okay. I'm not sure if you all heard the sound. I didn't hear it on my end, but basically it explained who is involved in the project, and you could see the list of partners on the left side of the screen here, and explained that it was going to be a trying to remember what the name. Next slide, I can go through that there. It's going to be a food market associated property. It's going to have some restaurants and some outdoor seating areas, and then offices above for related activities. And these are the renderings that were in the video for those who may not have been able to see the video. Next. The third example is the Pritchard Hotel in Huntington, West Virginia. It's a large 14-story building in downtown, significant for its hotel association. It is owned by a church organization, and the initial plans for the building were to convert it for a transitional housing and associated programs and activities for families and people who had recently gone through trouble. What eventually happened is a developer was solicited, and it was determined that it was probably better to use the building for housing purposes rather than that general housing. And I'll explain what the program is. And here you can see some of the on the left side, the elevator lobby, and on the right side where the former restaurant used to be. Next. And then just some other general photographs of what the building looked like before the project was started. You could see on the right top slide that the roof had been leaking for a while, and we had a microcosm on the 13th floor. And then on the lower left, you could see the building went through a phase 1 and a phase 2, and then also through a remediation program through the Marshall Brownfields Center. And you could see what the building looked like after that when they remediated the paint and the materials on the first floor in the lobby. Next. The building was built in 1924, and as I said, it was a very significant historical site in Huntington. It was half a block away. It is half a block away from the railroad depot, so it was one of the first places that people went to. And then it also had significant famous figures who stayed there. For example, JFK had his headquarters during the presidential election there, and other important people had stayed there or had events there. Next. So the future is, I don't know if my arrow shows up on the screen, but the future is that the lower level on the right will be storefronts. The second floor will be tenant space. The second floor on the right will be tenant space for offices. And then everything above that in the tower will be 13 floors of senior residences. On the left, there's a 2-story section. In that section, there will be services, health services associated with senior programs. And so it's all a very symbiotic relationship in the building. We're currently under construction. We're hoping to be finished by January of 26. Next. And this shows you the complexity of who's involved, how you get your financing, and who is participating in the project. This is the dedication brochure, which listed everybody who had a piece in the action. Next. And the final example I won't go through generally, it's that it's a vacant lot on a site where a building had collapsed in 2018, I believe it was. And a local church owns it and looked at it as a potential for a fellowship hall, but it is now being studied under an assessment and planning grant to have a structure that will be an indoor market as an adjunct to the adjacent farmers market. Next. And now I guess Meredith's going to speak.
All right, thanks, Mike. So I'm Meredith Dreistadt. I am with the West Virginia State Historic Preservation Office. I'm a structural historian there, and I most of my work is concerned with the historic tax credit and with certified local governments, but I also do any number of other things. So it's a little bit of my background. Next slide, please. So we're going to talk first a little bit about Section 106. So if you are receiving any federal money, have ever received federal money, you have and or will go through Section 106 to some degree. Sometimes these projects are undertaken, these reviews are undertaken by the federal agency that is granting the funding or granting the permitting. However, sometimes those agencies delegate that task out to you potentially. So it's a good thing to get a sense of what we're looking at. And this is just a recent project that we looked at in Charleston, West Virginia, talking about the demolition of a historic garage building attached to a building. So just a sense of kind of the overview of our projects. We work on anything from very, very small sites like a garage to, large historic complexes. Next slide. So when we're looking at historic properties, there is a criteria for evaluation. We are doing federal level review, essentially for the Department of the Interior. So we use the Secretary of the Interior's criteria for evaluation. to determine if the building is historic. What does that mean? So first point there, being old does not mean historic. Historic really does mean that it has some kind of historic fabric, historic significance that is worthy of protection. So just because something is old, it might have been severely altered over time. It may not look like its historic appearance. So that's what this review is kind of unpacking. So the Section 106, that term comes from the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966. So that was signed into law under Johnson's administration. And it is literally Section 106 of the Act. And if you do want to read it, it's maybe not a fun read, but it is an important read because it does pertain to any federal undertaking, including granting, permitting, any kinds of those items that our office and any SHPO would review. Historic does refer to properties which are eligible for listing or are listed in the National Register of Historic Places. So again, trying to understand what that word historic means. Just because it's old, not necessarily historic. So the criteria that we're looking at are, is it associated with an event that is a significant event? So is it showing a pattern of growth in a community, sort of a 1950s, 1940s post-war community? That might be an important event that we want to capture through a historic property. Is it associated with criteria B, which would be association with a significant person? And usually when we're talking about criteria B, we're looking at when the person was most active and productive in their life. So if someone was just born in a building, it's generally not as important as if they were born there, lived there their whole life, their whole lives, or if they were just, maybe a prolific poet at the time when they were living in that building. That's usually what we're looking for. Criterion C is generally one of the larger discussions for significance, and that really has to do with architectural design, construction, engineering design, things like that. So we're looking for something, I'm not necessarily saying your Frank Lloyd Wrights of the world, but it might be a significant example of Victorian architecture. And then criterion D is also something to consider, especially with brownfields. This is generally pertaining to archaeological sites. So can they provide information through research? That's usually what D is for. Next, please. Eligibility. So what makes a building eligible? Of course, we talked about the standards there, but we also need to have integrity of structure. So again, does it look like the historic structure of old? Does it still represent that time period? On the right here, we have Camp Washington Carver, and it really generally has been unaltered. So it has extremely good integrity. I think the roof has been replaced probably with an improper material, but that's probably the only thing that's really changed with this 1940s camp structure. In-kind repairs or replacements are always something we're looking for. This building in particular has, it's the largest chestnut log building in West Virginia. So we're always looking for chestnut logs to repair and replace in kind. So we can continue to say that about this building. So those in-kind repairs are important. And then of course, retaining the interior layout is important as well. Not necessarily always so important when it comes to just assessing the building's information. Usually the most important part of a building is the exterior for preservation purposes. Standards for contributing properties when they're not individually listed. I should have specified that individually listed properties are those that have their own nomination to the National Register versus contributing properties, which are contributing to a larger historic district. So they're usually a little less stringent than those individually listed properties that need to have all of these items checked off on a list, more or less. But generally there, we're looking for integrity of setting and some exterior integrity as well. So when you think of your larger historic districts, your Richmonds and all these different districts that are really more important as a whole instead of as individual pieces of a property, that's what we're looking for there. Next slide. And so what does initiating a Section 106 process even look like? Like I said, oftentimes the federal government is going to be the one that's initiating this with our office. So you may not see all of these exact processes play out yourself, but they may ask you to provide some information and or, like I said, it could be delegated to you. So it would fall to you to assist with this. So the first step, of course, is to initiate the Section 106 review. So that's essentially going to be gathering your information together and submitting that information to your SHPO. Of course, through that, you're going to be identifying your historic properties. So getting a map together saying this is where these resources are. These are the important resources. Here are why they might be significant and why they may not be significant. And then discussing what you plan to undertake with the project. So are you going to greatly affect a historic property in a way that will no longer allow it to qualify for the National Register when it could have previously? Is it something where there really is no historic character at all? There are no historic resources, perhaps, or something has just been so altered. So, any effects would be not significant enough. That would be another outcome. And so if we do have an effect, if we go through these 3 items and we do have an effect that is going to be a negative effect, an adverse effect, as we call it in the business, then we want to work with you to minimize, avoid, or mitigate, usually MMA. So we want to avoid those effects as much as possible, either by saying, okay, you would need to clean up this brownfield. Maybe we will try to treat the materials inside the building and remove the hazardous materials instead of demolishing the whole structure. That would be a great way to minimize or avoid any negative effects. And then mitigation might be saying, okay, that we know there's really it's kind of a lost cause for this building. So what we'll do is maybe create some signage or document the property very well through inventory forms or through perhaps National Register nomination. That's a good strategy for mitigation. Next slide. And then really the bread and butter for me, financial incentives for preservation are abounding, and we hope they continue to be. But any kind of financial incentive that can help someone take a brownfield or historic property that is a brownfield and transform it into a modern day use is something we want to be a part of and help fund. Next slide. So I'll touch on the Secretary of the Interior standards. So we talked about the SOI criteria for evaluation earlier. The standards are how we treat the historic properties themselves. And I'm not going to go through each of the 10 standards in great detail, but I'll give you kind of the overview, the highlights of the 10 standards. So really what we're trying to do is enforce retaining historic details, architecture, spatial relationships. So we want to see historic corridors maintained where we can. And any other craftsmanship features. So this building is also in West Virginia. Mike and I work in West Virginia. So for those of you who are not in the state, I apologize, but hopefully these examples can translate. But this is the Progress Building in Huntington, and it was a historic tax credit project, as well as received some grants. But you can see that the windows on the left-hand side before the project began had that aluminum panel infill on the top, and that the more importantly, the storefront was this 80s or 90s faux stone material. And so when the owners came to us and said, we want to retain the historic character, but we also want to remove some of these non-historic elements, we were on board and said, okay, here's the kind of windows that we're going to want to look for. We're going to want to look for large 1/1s that take up the whole space, as shown through historic photographs of this building, as well as recreating that open storefront with all the glazing. So that's what we're looking to do. Any changes that create a false sense of history, we don't want to see with the standards. So, if you think, oh, let's put this beautiful mosaic tile all over the downstairs floor where there was not one historically, we generally don't want to see that. We'd like to see a more simple tile to not create a sense of maybe more wealth in the builder of the building than there was historically. We always encourage retaining historic significance, things that have added on to the building's history over time. So anything that's usually over 50, generally speaking, unless it's outside of the building's period of significance, are things that we kind of want to retain with the building. So we're getting to the point in time wherein drop-in ceilings, ACT ceilings, may be considered historic in some buildings. I'll say that, not all buildings, but your mid-century, office buildings and things like that. But those things that have been put in place 50 or so years ago that are now historic and now parts of the building's history are things we want to keep. We always encourage repair over replace, and the use of any gentle chemical and physical treatments, of course, especially with masonry, any archaeological resources. If there are some, we want to see those saved in place. And then we do allow for additions through the standards for rehabilitation. Next slide, please. And apologize for the train, if you can hear that. The historic tax credit is probably the largest tool for rehabilitation, reuse of historic structures federally. So it applies to all those and also through state programs as well. So the HTC, it allows building owners, so you have to own whoever's doing this project has to own it, who have completed a historic rehabilitation to receive income tax credits based on the qualified expenses spent during the rehabilitation. So basically, when you are spending money on the rehab of a building, that money is money you can receive a historic tax credit on, more or less. It is administered by the National Park Service at the federal level and state historic preservation offices. I believe 37 states across the US have state historic tax credit programs. But even if you don't, the SHPO is still going to review the federal tax credit portion as well. So both offices will be involved no matter what. And in FY23, it leveraged over $8 billion in private investment. So that's just last fiscal year through the program in historic buildings. And it is a 3-step application process for any applicant. Next slide. So the commercial credit is kind of the bigger credit, and that's really what I'm going to be talking about. But it's a 20% federal income tax credit, and like I said, it may include a state credit. State credits can be anywhere between 10 to 25. Sometimes they're larger for rural areas or for projects that include, low-income housing and things like that. So, but just check that out for your state. Eligibility requirements generally, though, for the federal program is that buildings must be listed on the National Register with a little asterisk. So if your building is not yet listed, you can get a preliminary determination of individual listing. And so you can kind of work on listing your project while you're undertaking the rehab at the same time, so it doesn't slow your project down. But for the most part, most of the projects we see are already listed on the NR. In order to receive the credit, you must expend the greater of $5,000 or the adjusted basis of the building within generally a 2-year window, 5 years if the phased rehabilitation is part of the plan. That's a complicated one, and it's one that there is a formula for to find out what your adjusted basis is. Generally speaking, if someone is just purchasing a building and it's in rough shape and they pay $40,000 for it, they're going to have to spend $40,000 to receive the credit. And then the Secretary of the Interior standards, of course, are going to be met throughout the project. That's what our offices are here to ensure through our review. And then lastly, the same entity that owned the property during the rehab must own that property for 5 years after the rehab is complete. And we do that so that people aren't sort of flipping buildings and selling them right away. We want to keep people in the areas. Next slide. And then I'm not going to get into the residential credit, but there are residential credits in these 4 states and territories, regions that we're talking about here today. Sorry, DC, you don't have one, but but anyway, talk to your state historic preservation office to see if residential projects could also benefit from these credits. Next slide. So what are the QREs that you can receive tax credits on? Really, I would consider it any structural component of a building. So think your walls, your roofs, your foundations, windows, anything of that nature. Other things like soft costs, architectural and engineering fees are going to count, and then construction period interests and taxes as well. And really anything that you charge to a capital account will count towards the credit. Non-qualified costs are the purchase price of the building itself, unfortunately. Any additions we do review, but they are not part of the QREs. So if you're adding a deck on the rear or another addition to the property for more housing, those are not qualified expenses. Any appliances like your refrigerators, dishwashers, things like that, as well as cabinets, do not count towards the credit. Those are generally more modern things. They get changed out very quickly, so that's why they're not part of it. Any non-original decks, exterior facilities work, so no landscaping and things of that nature. And feasibility studies also do not count. Next slide. Historic preservation grants. I'm going to talk more generally about the federal grants that are available to brownfield sites, potentially historic sites. So the National Park Service has a number of grants that they offer on an annual basis, the largest of which is the Save America's Treasures Grant Program, in that it gives you the largest amount of funding, and that is for buildings that have national significance. So I would reach out to your SHPO to see if your building could receive that grant funding if it has national significance. Any underrepresented communities grants, those help to get resources of underrepresented communities on the National Register so that you can receive grants in the future. History of Equal Rights grants is for any sort of equality, fighting for equality over the span of history in these historic places. That's usually what those are for. Same with African American civil rights grants, historically Black colleges and universities grants as well. Battlefield restoration, disaster recovery grants, which are usually just expelled during large disasters. Next slide. The National Trust for Historic Preservation is another place to turn to. They were a branch of the federal government, and I think they sort of split off and they're their own kind of nebulous nonprofit, so a large group, but they have a National Trust Preservation Fund. They have an African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund, National Fund for Sacred Places, which they partner with Sacred Places to fund that program. So that's for a lot of churches like this one on the left here that can receive some support financially or through technological and technical research. And then my favorite is the Cynthia Woods Mitchell Fund for Historic Interiors. I've never heard of anybody receiving this grant because I'm not super privy into that world, but if you have a historic interior that needs rehab, I think it's a nice little grant. Next slide. And your State Historic Preservation Office generally, almost always, has grants as well. And those grants, in a more wide sense, can be applied to pre-development projects, like the Taggart Hotel here in Elkins, West Virginia, and feasibility studies. So looking at creating drawings for new architectural drawings that you can bring things up to code compliance and make sure that everybody's safe in a building. And also just reconstruction generally or rehabilitation generally. Any physical preservation might be a part of your SHPO's grant funding as well. Generally, those are what we call brick and mortar grants, and they can help with small to large size projects to rehab. And then surveys and nominations, if your building or buildings are not on the National Register yet, generally your SHPO has a survey and planning grant is generally what they're called to help fund those projects. Next slide. Other grants, you might look towards regional grant funding. So like statewide preservation groups, regional preservation organizations, any friends groups in your city might be great. Municipality grants like facade improvement, upper floor incentives grants, which is really great. A city here in West Virginia, Wheeling, has had a facade and upper floor incentive grants, and that really helped to redevelop these historic properties, not just on the first floor, but on the second floor as well. Any general development grants, so they might provide some hands-on preservation funding through that as well. Next slide. And LIHTC credits can be sort of complicated because they are competitive, generally speaking, throughout different states. But it is a federal program and is administered by the state and local LIHTC agencies. So you may want to reach out to your individual organization. If you just type in low-income housing tax credits and your state, you will find out where they are. But they are for substantial rehabilitations and for acquisitions, and that's kind of how they might pertain to historic properties. Next slide. So as a case study, I have chosen the Golden Rule Building in Belington, West Virginia. I think it's a great study because it really used a lot of this funding from brownfields to LIHTC credits to historic tax credits and grants, and it really just kind of ran the gamut of how a building in a tiny town in West Virginia, a great town, but tiny town, can use these financial incentives. So next slide. So just a quick history. It was built in 1902 as a wholesale grocery distribution building, the Valley Grocery Company, and then eventually became the Golden Rule Building, which was a little bit more related to clothing, furniture, and shoes. And it was operating as such until 1999. We are sort of centered in between the West Virginia Central Rail Line on one side, and then Crim Avenue, which is the main street through Belington. So it's really kind of in the crux of both transportation routes. It included a grist mill at the time and a water-powered elevator, which is still there, and it's very cool. And it was identified by our statewide nonprofit as an endangered property in 2014, which really kind of put it on the map for people to purchase and redevelop it, which it was in 2017 by our nonprofit in the area, Woodlands Development Group. Next slide. So some initial challenges with the Golden Rule. First off, it was not listed in the National Register, so it is one of those cases. So it became a discussion of, do we list it first? Do we do the part one for the tax credit first? Do we kind of, how do we do this? And that was something that our office was involved with. Also importantly, and very important for a lot of buildings that you'll run into, is that the building was filled with old merchandise. This picture does not do justice to how much stuff was in this building. It was like floor to ceiling in some places. So it required a lot of effort. And then also challenges, and we acknowledge this, that the low-income housing tax credit and the historic rehab tax credit can sometimes be, I don't want to say adversarial, but they can be a little complicated to use together. Because sometimes LIHTC folks want the brand new windows and the new roof, and then our office want to keep and rehab the old windows and old roof. So it can be a little bit of a tightrope to walk. So that's part of the challenge. And then also it was owned by a nonprofit, which required creating a complex ownership structure in order to use the 20% federal tax credit. So we'll talk about that. Next slide, please. So these are some of the partnerships that were, sort of leaned on for this tax credit project, this rehab project. And you can just see from the sense of this how many people were involved through, local Belington Revitalization Committee up to the Federal Home Loan Bank of Pittsburgh and Community Works, USDA, Brownfields. Our National Heritage Area provided some funding towards the end. Housing Development Fund, of course, our office and the Park Service, and Main Street. So a lot of different players involved. Next slide. So just to get a sense of the space of this and how we're looking at it from a tax credit perspective, on the left here, you have a large open warehouse space, and that's really what this building was used for historically. There is on the bottom left a historic office building that had a tin ceiling and a safe and things like that. So that was definitely something character defining that we wanted to retain, but it was very open historically, and you can see that from the photograph. So next slide. So in order to keep that first floor open space concept, it's kind of a hard drawing to see, but the sense is that the office space on the bottom left was retained, a smaller kind of office and bakery space was added on the top right, and then it was largely kept open as the warehouse space with some remote work spaces and things like that as well. So it was a great way to reuse the space and still keep that open warehouse feeling. Next slide. Upstairs, it really was just stairwells and an open floor plan. And so the idea here was to turn this building into low-income apartments. And so the discussion was, how do we create the look and feel, keep that long space of the open floor plan while also filling in with new apartments in this historic space. So next slide. So it's a little messy and a little hard to see, but this was the decision that we came to, was that retaining a long corridor that followed the length of the building while having the historic truss systems, the wooden supports and everything retained throughout the spaces, throughout the apartments, and throughout the corridors was the way to go, and still make this space usable. So you can see we have a number of apartment buildings that really took advantage of the natural lighting in the building. They pushed the corridor against the wall that did not have windows, which worked out very well. The wall that's on the bottom of that drawing did have window openings as well as the both ends of the building. So that's where the corridor was placed and why. Next slide. So a quick overview snapshot is that Woodlands purchased this in 2017. They had AmeriCorps members help cleaning out the building, processing items. They did a big sale on those items to raise funds. They created the Golden Rule LP, which was the entity that contained not only the nonprofit, but also for-profit entities who could use the federal tax credits. They received a LIHTC allocation in 2018, received Part 2 approval from us and the Park Service in 2019, and it was listed in the National Register in that same year. And then in December of 2020, the rehab was completed. Next slide. So some befores and afters. You can still see some of that character retained throughout. The office space is still kind of a cool office space with the rehabbed windows. You can see the tin ceiling through there. So it really kind of came out pretty neat. Next slide. And then today, the Golden Rule, on the first floor, we have the Barber County Family Support Center, which distributes food and provides support to local families to the Belington and Barber County area. We also have the Belington Bakery, which has really great bagels, of course, and pastries, cafe. They have like a little local artist marketplace and co-working spaces, so that's pretty neat. And then on the second and third floors, there are 10 affordable housing units based on income above. And I believe those have been full since they opened. So next slide. And then this is not the Belington, this is not the Golden Rule building, but just to give you a sense of what a financing stack might look like. And actually, this is the Pritchard that Mike talked about earlier. Here's how some of those stacks might break down through LIHTC credits, through the tax credits, through loan fund, loans, mortgages, things like that. Give you a good sense of that. Next slide. All right, I think that's it from us.
Thank you so much, Mike and Meredith. We really appreciate that. All right, Ms. Haley has run a poll for us. That helps us with our metrics to help us understand if the information we've provided was helpful for you and if there's anything that we can do to improve that. So if you could just take that quickly, we would appreciate it. Next slide, please. We just want to let you know about a few things coming up. One, there's kind of going to be a part 2 to this Preserve and Conserve webinar. And so that's when participants can learn about the importance of updating regularly their National Register Historic Districts. So stay tuned. That'll be in June with a different team of presenters, but folks who are familiar with Mike and Meredith. And then also in August is the National Brownfield Conference, and in September would be the West Virginia Conference. So you can find information for the conferences there, and soon we will be sharing information for the June webinar as soon as we have it. Next slide, please. And just want to remind you how we can help as the tab provider when it comes to brownfields, and also ways we can provide help is to connect you with folks like Mike and Meredith. So don't hesitate to reach out to us. Next slide, please. And finally, you have their contact information. So if you have any questions about your particular site, please give them a shout, send them an email. And again, today was geared to West Virginia. We tried to reach out to folks throughout the region, but for today, we were just able to get West Virginia, and I know we brought you the best for this webinar. So if you have any questions and you're not in West Virginia, I do know that Mike and Meredith would be happy to help answer any questions or point you in the right direction if necessary. So thank you so much. If you do have any questions, we'll stick around for a few minutes. You can either just ask it out loud or send a message in the chat. And again, thank you so much for taking the time.
Thanks, everyone. This is Logan Smith with Appalachian Forest National Heritage Area. I thank you for the list of other available grants. I do want to point out that Appalachian Forest Grant Program has made grants to small historic preservation or components of small historic preservation projects, such as planning, bringing in consultants and so forth. So reach out to us at afnha.org. And take a look at our grant programs that are annual, and we'd be happy to talk to you about your projects within our region. We're an 18-county region in Maryland and West Virginia, so that's another resource for you.